Before talking about anti-Semitism, I think it's very important to specify what anti-Semitism is, because there's been a great deal of confusion about what it is. So I want to say a few things about what anti-Semitism is and the way it's different from racism. Not worse, not better, but different. One way of getting at the specificity of anti-Semitism is to look at, and here I'll be going back to something I wrote quite a while ago, to look at the specificity of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was not the same as mass murder, even genocide, but what characterized it was that it was a program for total extermination in ways that contravened most understandings of instrumental reason. So, for example, in August 1944, when the German armies are already being driven back to the West by the Red Army, and the Americans and British have landed in Normandy, the Germans have nothing better to do but to round up the few Jews in the island of Rhodos and transport them all the way to Auschwitz. So they're using means of transport and logistics that could be used in the war effort to fight another war. And that's the only way you can interpret it. The Jews there must be a reason within the Nazi imaginary why even when they're losing the war, you have to make sure that you continue to wipe out Jews. Many Jews made the mistake of thinking that the Nazis, as bad as they were, would also conform to some form of instrumental reason. So, for example, there were factories in the Polish city of Łódź who were producing uniforms and other materials for the Wehrmacht. They thought as long as they remain productive for the Wehrmacht, they'll be spared. They were not. The analytic question is how to explain a policy of total extermination, a program that some would argue really deeply contravened the material interests of the German armies towards the end of the war. So at this point, I want to switch to what anti-Semitism, the kind of anti-Semitism that stood behind the Holocaust, what it is. Modern anti-Semitism shouldn't be confused with everyday anti-Jewish prejudice. It's an ideology, a worldview that became widespread in Europe in the second half of the 19th century. Its emergence presupposed earlier forms of anti-Semitism, which for centuries had been integral to Christian Western civilization. What is common to all forms of anti-Semitism is the degree of power that's attributed to Jews. But it's not only the degree, but also the quality of power attributed to the Jews that distinguishes modern anti-Semitism. Now, probably all forms of racism attribute potential power to the other. This power, however, usually in racism, is concrete, material, or sexual. It's the potential power of the oppressed, of the so-called Untermenschen. The power attributed to Jews by modern anti-Semitism is not concrete and physical, rather it's intangible, abstract, universal, and global. This power is extremely difficult to check. It stands behind phenomenon, but is not identical with them. It's hidden, it's conspiratorial. According to this worldview, which of course reached its apex under the Nazis, the Jews constitute an immensely powerful international conspiracy responsible for both plutocratic capitalism and socialism, as well as the rise of vulgar market culture and the decline of traditional values and institutions. The Jews were held responsible for economic crises and identified with the range of social restructuring and the transformation of the social landscape that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Within this imaginary, the Jews are not so much considered an inferior race, but an anti-race, responsible for historical processes that are profoundly dangerous and destructive to the well-being of other peoples. The Jews are a threat to life itself. Now, very frequently, it used to be in the literature on National Socialism, this ideology was interpreted as profoundly anti-modern. After all, both plutocracy and working class movements were concomitants of capitalist modernity. The problem with such interpretations, however, is that the modern would certainly include industrial capital, yet industrial capital was precisely not an object, was never an object of anti-Semitic attacks, even in a period of rapid industrialization. Now, an approach is required that can make sense of those aspects of modernity rejected by the Nazis and those aspects that were accepted, and that can relate that pattern to modern exterminatory anti-Semitism. Now, I suggest, and I suggested this in this article that was mentioned, that a more rigorous analysis of central features of anti-Semitism and more generally of the so-called modern and anti-modern elements of Nazism can be provided by an approach based on Marx's concept of fetishism. Unlike interpretations that focus on the term modern, such an approach can provide the basis for an analysis of certain systematic forms of social misrecognition, for it entails a series of worked out distinctions between what is and what appears to be. Within this theoretical framework, Marx's categories such as commodity, Ware, and capital are not merely economic categories, but purport to simultaneously grasp forms of social relations and forms of thought. The concept of fetishism refers to forms of thought that remain bound to the forms of appearance of capitalist social relations, thereby naturalizing those social relations. Now, by relating modern anti-Semitism epistemologically to the category of capitalism, such an approach attempts to address the question of the differential attitude of Nazism towards aspects of modernity, and also provides a point of departure for relating exterminatory anti-Semitism to the historical dynamic of the modern world. Proceeding from this point of departure, the fundamental relations of capitalism were analyzed by Marx as dualistic. They're characterized by the opposition of an abstract, general, homogeneous dimension, the value dimension, and that is a dimension that, although social, is impersonal and apparently objective, and a concrete, particular material dimension. Now, I'm not going to fully elaborate on this, But one of the things that Marx talks about is the way in which the concrete dimension of capital isn't recognized as being part of capital. Only the abstract side is seen and criticized already by French socialists such as Proudhon, right? The idea that money is the root of all evil. Now, it's striking that the specific characteristics of the power attributed to Jews by modern antisemitism, abstraction, intangibility, universality, mobility, are all characteristics of the abstract dimension of the social forms fundamentally characterizing capitalism. Moreover, this dimension, the abstract dimension, like the supposed power of the Jews, does not appear directly, but always in the form of a material carrier. Within the framework of the Marxian analysis that I'm alluding to, although the social relations specific to capitalism are dualistic, both abstract and concrete, they can appear as the abstract dimension alone. Their concrete dimension, labor and its products, although molded by capital, then appear to be simply thingly, outside of capitalism. Forms of anti-capitalist thought that remain bound to these forms of appearance tend to perceive capitalist modernity only in terms of the manifestations of the abstract dimension, while positively embracing its concrete dimension. So, for example, money is opposed as the root of all evil to the purportedly socially natural dimensions of labor and its products. This dualism of the forms allows industrial production to appear as a material creative process which is separable from capital, which is understood only in terms of its abstract dimension, as rootless, parasitic finance capital. The dualistic character of the whole allows for forms of revolt, forms of anti-capitalism, in which glorification of the purportedly pre-modern material nature, blood, the soil, labor, community, goes hand in hand with an affirmation of modern elements such as industrial capital and technology. The notion of fetishized anti-capitalism, then, allows one to understand how these disparate modern and pre-modern elements can be grasped in terms of an overarching commonality. They appear to be concrete and organic as healthy counter-principles to the abstract. This helps explain why modern anti-Semitism, which railed against many aspects of the modern world, could affirm industrial capital and technology. This form of anti-capitalism, then, is based on a one-sided attack on the abstract law, abstract reason, or on another level, money and finance capital, from the standpoint of the healthy, rooted, and natural concrete. In biologized modern anti-Semitism, this fetishized opposition of the abstract and the concrete, the artificial and the natural, became conceptualized as the racial opposition of Jews and Aryans. According to this interpretation, the Jews were not merely seen as capitalists, nor were they identified only with money and the sphere of circulation. Rather, they were identified with capitalism itself. Capitalism, however, did not appear to include technology and industry. Instead, capitalism appeared to be only its manifest abstract dimension, which in turn was held responsible for the economic, social, and cultural changes associated with the rapid development of modern industrial capitalism. The Jews then became the personifications of the intangible, destructive, immensely powerful international domination of capital. The overcoming of capitalism and its negative social effects became conceptualized as the overcoming of the Jews. The power and danger of modern anti-Semitism, then, results from its character as a comprehensive worldview. It explains the unsettling and destructive changes wrought by capitalism and gives voice to feelings of helplessness in the face of those changes. Modern anti-Semitism, I suggest, should be understood as a revolt against history as constituted by capitalism, misrecognized as a Jewish conspiracy. That conspiracy would have to be destroyed if the world were to be saved. In terms of its self-understanding, then, anti-Semitism has an emancipatory, even redemptive quality. And it's for this reason, already in the early 20th century, that, God, I forgot his name, the German social democrat, Bebel, that Bebel referred to anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools. It's because it has this emancipatory dimension. And that really makes it different from other forms of racism. Now, this ideology, I want to suggest, was an absolutely necessary condition for the Holocaust, which should be understood as a perverse revolution, an attempt to save the world from the destructive tyranny of the abstract. And for that reason, all the Jews had to be exterminated. Very different than mass murder. That's my little introduction to anti-Semitism. So now I just want to say a few brief words about the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. What makes, I think, any real political discourse on this theme difficult is that on the one hand, you have the Israeli right, let's say Netanyahu, saying that all criticisms of Israel, its policies, the occupation, are anti-Semitic. On the other hand, you have many on the left who argue that no form of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. Both are wrong. It's true, not all critiques of Israel are anti-Semitic. However, there are forms of anti-Zionism that are anti-Semitic. One is the enormous power attributed to Israel by some. That Israel really is the tail that wags the dog, the United States. The United States is simply kind of like a stupid moron that doesn't understand very much, and the clever Israeli Jews really are going after a kind of world domination through the Americans. Not only is Zionism accorded a tremendous amount of power by many, certainly not all, anti-Zionists, but it's seen as being, as representing a level of malevolence and evil unsurpassed in the world. And that's really quite remarkable. It's been remarkable in the last few years. The Ba'ath in Iraq may have massacred tens of thousands of Kurds and other Shiites. The left didn't take a position. The Assad family in Syria, Assad the Elder killed 20,000 members of the Muslim Brotherhood in one weekend in 1982. Nothing on the left. Bashir has probably killed between 250 and 300,000 people. The left is silent. The left mobilizes when it comes to Israel, period. It's the difference between a critique of Israel and the absence of critique of anything else that marks that form of anti-Zionism anti-Semitic. There's an additional dimension, and that is a much older one, which is a kind of a traditional leftist hostility towards any kind of Jewish collective self-determination. This began in debates in the Russian Social Democratic Party at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Bund, which was a socialist Jewish workers' organization, walked out because the party would not address the issue of anti-Semitism, and the party lost 40% of its rank-and-file members. Since then, first the Russian Social Democrats, then the communists were incredibly hostile to any notion of Jewish self-determination. And finally, there is a kind of an idea that a lot of leftists and liberals have, which is a kind of a little dream, that if only it weren't for Israel, or in some versions, Israel and the United States, we'd have world peace. Just pull them out and everything would be okay. And I think this layering helps distinguish then criticisms of the right in Israel, of the occupation, of the policies, from what I think is essentially anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism. So that's my introduction.
Ich habe vergessen, am Anfang was zu sagen, da wir nicht besonders viel Geld haben, geben wir so eine kleine Spendendose dort. Okay. Gibt es Wortmeldungen? Ich würde bitten, laut und deutlich zu sprechen, weil wir eine Aufnahme machen. Das kann ich mir nicht vorstellen.
Wait.
Das war für Englisch. Über die Frage der instrumentellen Vernunft, die Sie am Anfang erwähnt haben. Das, was daran verwundert, ist nicht, was Sie den Nazis zuschreiben.
Warum?
What I'm confused by is not what you ascribe to the Nazis in terms of acting not according to instrumental rationality. That is correct, but I'm confused, like, whether you assume that otherwise societies, like either bourgeois societies or fascist societies, work by and large according to instrumental reason, because that seems for me hard to maintain. Looking, for example, a cheap example, for instance, would be like the maintenance of the prison system. I mean, it's a known sentence that like it would be cheaper to send everyone to college as opposed to the prison. It doesn't improve anyone in terms of like deterrence and everything, but it still maintains. So I wonder if, for instance, that institution can be described as rational, or else if perhaps this and many other institutions within the society or fascist societies are in fact non-rational in terms of rationality.
You're right, and maybe I should think of another term to use. Because the difference is that, let's say, the American prison system would not be held onto if the very existence of the United States suddenly was at stake. What the Nazis did was they continued to kill as many Jews as they could from distant lands, even though they were clearly losing the war. So there is a certain kind, there had to be a reason for doing it. There must have been a powerful impetus to have to continue killing the Jews. Not that they're bloodthirsty or something, but there had to be a reason, is what I was trying to say. You're right, perhaps I shouldn't have used the word instrumental rationality, because that would suggest that, as you correctly pointed out, everybody else acts according to instrumental reason, which they don't. We could talk about the prison system, but that would get us off.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, I really appreciate your work very much and learned. I think everything one has to know about anti-Semitism from reading the work. Just a short question about the differentiation you made between like the wording of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And basically, as I understood, we said it's a counter objection with word domination expectations on the first point. Second point is hostility towards national liberation or self-determination, and the third one, threat to world peace by US Israel.
What was the...
I would definitely agree with all three learning points, I draw very much from the work, and the work of Israel with anti-Semitism, and I will argue with relating to your work, is why I asked that the colonial framing of Israel, Israel being a colonial state, a settler colony, is also in itself structurally anti-Semitic, because if you think it through, this argument, and this is like one base argument of anti-Zionist activism worldwide, as you know, the two. If you think it through, that only functions if the UN, the United Nations, is a sort of colonial instrument, a sort of a colonial tool. You know what I mean? So I would say, I certainly do not agree with the Netanyahu position that every single articulation, also within the boycott stuff, which is structurally anti-Semitic, but you know what I mean? I really feel that one has to differentiate, but on the structural level, I would argue that the colonial framing is always, it is structurally anti-Semitic.
This is a very... Well, I think it's a tricky issue, because I think a lot depends on who is doing the colonial framing. And what I mean by that is that you have really two fundamentally different experiences and narratives that clash against one another. For the Palestinians, the Zionist settlement from the very beginning, they regard as being colonial, and you can understand it from their point of view. For the Jews, Israel was a liberation. Right? A lot of people don't realize that after the war, the few thousands of Jews who remained were kept in camps. They were kept in camps because they couldn't emigrate. The other countries weren't taking them. Those that managed to return to Poland, there were pogroms. Those camps only emptied with the establishment of the State of Israel. So you have a situation really of right against right. Now, if the Palestinians think of it as anti-colonial, that's understandable. The Europeans should know better. No better. The anti-Semitism is integral to Europe. That's really where its origin is, where it was imported to the Middle East also, counting the Soviet Union as part of Europe, and the East Germans. And today, but this isn't necessarily just an issue of anti-Semitism, the Palestinian dream of driving all the Jews into the sea will not happen. It's not Algeria. It just won't happen. And the right-wing Israeli dream of somehow the Palestinians in the West Bank will pick up and go somewhere else won't happen. And any ideology that refuses to see that is reactionary. It may not always be anti-Semitic, but it's deeply reactionary.
If we try to develop
Louder.
If we try to develop your terminology coming from modern anti-Semitism toward a new form of anti-Zionism some further and speak of the term new anti-Semitism, which tries to grasp this people meeting from the left, the right, and the Islamic community with the same paroles. How would you describe the relationship between the anti-Zionism in the left and this coming from Islam? Because we can say that the Islamic anti-Semitism is the most deadly at the moment, but still, although the left anti-Semitism doesn't kill, how do you see this relationship between those two today?
I'm not sure that there's a necessary relationship, but they've become intertwined. And, but their origins are really quite different from one another. There are several factors, I think, at play on the first Arab and then Islamic side. One is that for decades, the issue of the destruction of Israel was central as an ideology of legitimation for almost all of the post-colonial Arab regimes. This acquired a very strong anti-Semitic bent after 1967, and it was after 1967 that the Soviet Union and its allies, especially the East Germans, were so furious that Israel defeated the major Soviet proxies, Syria and Egypt, that they unleashed the kind of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism that was developed under Stalin in his late years, where Zionism became rootless, cosmopolitan, and deeply, deeply destructive. And they hit the Arab world with this constantly. And there's a third thing, and that is, I think there's a crisis, and I said this before 2011, there's a crisis, a major crisis, and there has been for a while, in the Arab-speaking Muslim world. And that is that there's been an economic crisis since the late 70s. Standards of living, GDP per head, fell everywhere in the Arab world between 1980 and 2000, even in Saudi Arabia. You have a situation where there's economic misère, and you no longer convincingly can only refer to the colonial past. The reason why you can't is because some other areas of the world who were part of the Third World became very successful after about 1980. Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, China, India to some extent. So I think that there is a fertile ground for blaming this on the Jews in a classic sense. There's very little done, and the left certainly did not help here, to try to analyze what was the cause of this economic misère. What caused it? How do we understand it? And for much of the Western left, anti-Zionism is the last straw of what had been the anti-colonial struggles of the 1960s and 1970s. It's the last thing, otherwise they have nothing to say anymore. They really have nothing to say. They've devolved to a kind of left populism. I don't know if that addresses what. Yes?
I have a question. How would you see developments within certain European countries that are linked to Islamophobia, and now that certain issues from the right are incorporated by right-wing politicians, such as feminism and women's rights, and also the protection of Jews in Europe, become a rhetoric instrument of the right that has still deeply anti-Semitic structures within their...
Absolutely, which makes it even more complicated. Right? So that the anti-Semitic right now pretends that it's not, as part and parcel of their Islamophobia. I agree with that. I agree with your characterization. But I'm not sure what I'm going to say about it. I mean, Islamophobia, it seems to me, comes out of also a crisis, and it's a crisis that is primarily felt by the old working class. The old working class everywhere is in decline. And neither the press, nor certainly politicians, talk very rationally about the kind of structural changes behind this. So either they kind of just paper it over, or they say it's because of trade agreements, that's left-wing populism, like Bernie Sanders, or, like Donald Trump, they say it's because of the foreigners. The Mexicans, in the case of the United States, the Muslim hordes, in the case of Europe. The reason why it finds an echo, I think, is not simply scapegoating, it is really addressing the felt misère of a declining social class, is what I would say. The two, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, can also join hands. It's certainly not the case that that because some on the right suddenly become friends of the Jews, etc., that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are opposed. They're not. They're different from one another, but they really can go hand in hand.
My question would be, how can we encounter?
How can
we encounter
it? Encounter it? It's a good question. And no, it's a good question because how you encounter it politically.
I would have a proposal. Just acknowledge and work out the differences, stick to what you work out with regard to antisemitism.
Give you.
Maximum power projection.
I'm sorry, there's part I didn't hear.
Just acknowledge both. It exists, it coexists, so to speak. It functions differently, anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism, of course, because anti-Muslim racism lacks the extreme eliminatory power projection, but it's both. That's how to tackle it, in my opinion. Don't let them play it off against each other.
Yeah, but the way in which you try to deal with it really depends on the specific situation to which you are addressing it. The case in Germany might be quite different from the case in Austria, is different than the case in France. So I'm not sure that I could give a kind of a universal political, as we would say in American, silver bullet, that would work the same everywhere politically. Not fully satisfying, I know.
I was wondering if you think that there is a systematic connection from the anti-Semitism of the Nazis to other elements of their ideology. So in particular, I was thinking about their nationalism. So if you imagine the Jews as a kind of bad anti-race, don't you have to also think about something like a good counterpart?
Yes, of course, the Aryans.
But
it's not necessarily nationalistic. I think a lot of people mistake that. Because after all, especially with the war, the chief bearers of Nazi ideology become the SS. And the SS, as I hope most of you know, also had its international brigades. There were large French, Spanish, Italian, Danish, and Dutch. And of course, Ukrainians and Lithuanians in the SS. They saw it as a civil war, the internationalism of fascism against the internationalism of communism and the Jews, of course, the Jews. It's not, I don't think it's just nationalist. The British were very nationalist. They didn't think the Jews controlled the world. There's a lot of anti-Jewish prejudice in England. But that's different. For a while, the British thought they're the ones who controlled it. So I know there are other people who disagree with me and would emphasize the nationalism. I don't think so.
I had kind of a following up question to the Islamophobia which was mentioned before, where you said that probably there's a structural element in this. Would you think that it has something to do with post-industrial societies, with the situation of labor getting more and more disintegrated, and that actually this part of the population addressed the nation in order to save them from foreign labor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know the figures for Austria or for Germany because they were doing better than the United States for a while. But in the United States, the real wages of workers did not rise after 1973. They flatlined. And the way in which, in each situation, it looks a little different. In the United States, what began to happen is that people began to live off of debt. And they lived off of debt in part because your home could be used as a source from which you could borrow money, and many Americans own homes. So people would take out mortgages, and then they would be able to borrow money against their house, and that kept their standard of living. And that in the United States was the condition that crashed in 2007, 2008. And suddenly these people realize that they've been screwed, basically. So I think it has a lot to do with that. It also has a lot to do with the absence of any kind of real meaningful political discourse that helps people understand their own situation. There were a bunch of other hands.
I just wanted to add that I was very happy that you introduced the term anti-Muslim racism, because this is, I think, a better term than Islamophobia. Because when we look at the FPÖ in Vienna and Austria, they don't have a problem with Islam, they have a problem with Muslims, or people who are identified as Muslims, although they wouldn't consider themselves as such, whatever. But there are great relationships between right-wing parties and politicians in Europe and leaders from Islamic states, regimes, paramilitaries, whatever. So the problem is not this fear of Islam. Islam is being invited because of the idea of the Ummah, and there is a kind of fascination by it. So I think that Islamophobia is a polemic term that is very much used as a counter term to anti-Semitism, and has this idea of, well, anti-Semitism is not such a threat today, Islamophobia is a real problem. But I think anti-Muslim racism is something that's facts on the ground, and we need to speak about that. So thank you for this distinction. I think that's important.
Okay. I'll accept that.
Follow-up question. Might be too big, but I'm not sure I got the essence of what you two discussed right now. So are you saying that that the Holocaust happening in Germany was not necessarily related directly to the concept of German national identity? So maybe I misunderstood, and if no, then why did it happen in Germany?
It's a very long story why it happened in Germany. And actually, one should say why it happened in Germany, Austria.
Yeah.
Is really what one should say. That is a very long story, but it wasn't confined to Germany. It's just that in other countries, or in some other countries, certainly in the West, that right was met by strong anti-rightist movements. Stronger than what happened in Germany. Then there's a whole other story of what happened to the SPD and the KPD, etc. And you know, there's been a great deal written on that. But I was just trying to make the point that the Nazi attitude towards nationalism is actually ambivalent, is not unequivocal, is not eindeutig. On the one hand, they're nationalists. On the other hand, their idea of race war goes far beyond nationalism. And Hitler really hoped that the British would end up siding with him. They had great admiration for the British. They're also Aryans. Didn't have such admiration for the French.
I have a question about the text, Antisemitism and National Socialism.
Yeah.
There's an often heard critique that what you're doing is just drawing an analogy between the abstract Jew and the abstraction of money, of the commodity form, of commodity. And I interpret your text in a different way that I think you only understand it if you understand the commodity form, and that the commodity form is not just an abstraction in thinking, but that it's a real society structuring power, that the law, that the capitalist society is structured by the commodity form and necessarily, and all the other social dimensions, and that society that brings up this abstraction like money necessarily needs to concretize this abstraction, and it doesn't necessarily need to concretize it in the Jews, but it has to concretize it in some way. And that because the Jews is some kind of historic specificity. Would you agree with this interpretation, or is it an analogy?
It's not an analogy. I wasn't making an analogy. I know some people said it was an analogy, but I'll bite my tongue. They should know better. All I was doing, I'm not going to work through Band 1 of Kapital in a 15-page article. What I was trying to indicate for people who know anything about Kapital is that the Wagen form is actually the cell form for the concept of capital. And the reason why that's important is because it's capital that drives transformations, that changes society over and over and over again. The difference between disliking Jews as moneylenders in the Middle Ages and the 19th century is that, sure, you can dislike Jews as moneylenders, you can kill them, you don't feel as if the entire world is being structured by them. However, with capital, the entire world is being structured by abstract forms of domination that are changing everything. People have no idea what's going on. And Jews aren't just moneylenders, they're responsible for all of this misère. And so it was much more than an analogy. It was to talk about, I thought people would understand the workings of capital and the way in which all of these are epistemological categories, the way in which they could be understood, therefore, as being the result of some mysterious force. And that happened to be the Jews. That's why you've got to kill all of them. You don't just go after Jewish bankers, Jewish warehouse, department store owners, etc., etc. You kill everybody.
So would you say that the relationship between a certain form of faulty explanation of capitalism that is rooted in the fact that capitalism is a society that systematically makes its own workings kind of opaque and invisible, and then projected on the Jews, or use the word now, would you describe that as a kind of projection?
Of course it's a projection.
Yeah, right. I mean, one question I often get from people who encounter that kind of theory, of course, an understanding about why, well, it's a sort of dissatisfaction that on the one hand you have a structure that can explain why this projection is searching for an object, and then the Jews, because in a way there was a certain element of historical contingency, so you can explain why the Jews would be the ideal object for that kind of projection. But you could imagine, and it historically happens like that, it's instead just the finance capitalists or the speculators or whatever. And yeah, basically, would you say basically the Jews for historical reasons?
Basically, Jews what?
Because for historical reasons they find themselves in a position that just makes them the ideal objects for that kind of projection. Because they are enclosed in the circulation sphere, because they are successful in the face of rapid modernization that threatens to hold other parts of the population, and so on and so on.
Yes, of course.
I was wondering if that's part of the question. Maybe I also misunderstood the question.
Well, because I did it theoretically, but historically, the Jews acquire civil rights just when Central Europe begins industrializing. So you have all of these, which means, of course, cities explode in size. The peasants are no more the bearers of the nation in any way. Small tradesmen are going down. And suddenly you have these people who are the lawyers, the doctors, the journalists, the playwrights, not just the capitalists. They appear suddenly where they hadn't been before. And the socialists. So people put two and two together. Of course, that's contingent historical reasons. But in Europe, it couldn't have been anybody else.
Can I ask just a short question?
Sure.
Did you refer to Anna's work? Because this is exactly what you said.
Which work now? The Origins or the Eichmann book?
Origins.
Yeah, I think she makes a mistake.
She makes mistakes.
Yeah. Well, she, and in a different way, Horkheimer, Adorno, they read Tocqueville. And Tocqueville, as you may or may not know, when he writes about the French Revolution, he says the reason why the aristocrats became so hated in France in the late 18th century is because they had lost their social function. Once they had lost their social function, they became seen as parasites and completely dispensable. And so Hannah Arendt writes, she goes out of her way to say the Jews had been more important earlier and had lost their social function. She focuses on the court Jews and then the diplomats. People who become unnecessary, like the aristocrats, may generate hatred, as in France in the late 18th century. There isn't a program to exterminate the aristocrats. The idea of superfluity doesn't lead to extermination. It can lead to mass murder, but not extermination. So I think that she's wrong.
Because she didn't get the core of antisemitism.
No, I think she didn't get it.
Regarding German antisemitism. I have a question regarding German antisemitism at the beginning of the 20th century. There are some people like, I think, Paul Hilberg and Hans Neumann that say that on a quantitative level, antisemitism was not that widespread in Germany compared to the other, to most European countries. Now, when we look at the the assessment of Hilberg and Neumann wrong, that it was a very large quantity, it was very widespread. And did the Holocaust need a widespread anti-Semitism in the population, or was it not necessarily necessary?
Well, it's hard to do a counterfactual, but I think both Neumann and Hilberg, in different ways, misunderstand, or I would say I'm using anti-Semitism different than they are. They think that it's a matter of individual attitudes and prejudices. I don't. I think it's a cultural framing. It's a cultural framing, and you don't find out about the cultural framing by going and doing a survey. Do you like your Jewish neighbors? You've had examples of cultural framing like this before, not with the specificity of anti-Semitism, but the kind of racism that what existed in the colonies. You know, if you were driving a car and you hit an African child who died, it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it goes. If you interviewed that person, they wouldn't necessarily say that they hate Africans. It's just within that cultural framing, an African life just isn't worth very much. Certainly nothing like a British life, or a German, or a French. Yeah, so I think it's kind of misplaced. I mean, they're right. The Germans were no more anti-Semitic on an individual level than the French, and certainly the Poles, or the Ukrainians, or the Lithuanians, but that isn't the point, as I see it. Otherwise, you have this notion of, you know, the Nazis occupied Germany and then they occupied Austria. Yeah.
Anti-Muslim racism. And at first I thought, yeah, it might be a better way to talk about it than Islamophobia. But then I thought, in the second one, I was like, but that's not racism. Being anti-Islamic in a way it's discriminatory, but we're not talking about racism in the sense of we have a system of racism established. But the point that I want to make here is that I looked at a lot of biomedical literature, and I want to ask you about the reproduction of the category of the Jew within biomedical, in the biomedical domain, especially in the proliferation of genetics. More? So the point that I want to make here is there is a category system established in genetics that is based on sometimes colonial systems such as race or national basis or regional basis such as, well, if I sequence your genome, I can see that you're probably from a French region and 13% is from a Spanish region, and you also have a lot of research that specifies on a Jewish community, which is then made homogenic community, and it's often criticized as also looking at a lot of
that makes, I didn't hear the second half of that sentence. That makes a homogeneous.
What is made there is they make a category of a Jewish community, which is then made homogeneous. So saying there is a Jewish community and there's no differences between them. So there's sort of a racist element there in saying there is something that is different, which is genetic. How would you say, for me, it sometimes came up the element that this is something inherently anti-Semitic.
Not necessarily, it really depends. For example, there are certain genetic syndromes, like Tay-Sachs, that are much more widespread among Ashkenazi Jews than other Europeans or than Jews from North Africa or the Middle East. So medically, you can look for those markers when you're dealing with Jewish families. It really depends. Then maybe you have ideologues who are trying to find like the Jewish gene underneath everything. That's different, it seems to me. But I see no problem with saying, just as you say that African Americans are much more susceptible to what is called sickle cell anemia. Genetically much more susceptible than non-Africans. I don't think that that necessarily carries any kind of racial or certainly racist weighting.
Well, in the case of sickle cell anemia, there's actually a widespread criticism that only certain parts of the African continent,
certain parts of
the African continent are actually, you can actually find prevalence in sickle cell anemia, but it's not that all African Americans from that region, and a lot of the racist element that comes in here is not that there's somebody saying there is a prevalence for sickle cell anemia, but that also again a whole population gets homogenized and saying, okay, we market a certain medication or prescription to African Americans, but other parts, for example, in certain parts of Asia, sickle cell anemia is also a problem, but it get not the same medication that would help people with a certain marker for sickle cell anemia is marketed to a certain group and not to another, and there's the racial element coming in. So
you might be right. You're probably more familiar with this literature than I am. But I don't think it's necessarily racist. No one says that all Jews have Tay-Sachs, not even all Ashkenazi Jews, and no one says that all African Americans have sickle cell anemia.
Well, it's not necessary,
but you're going to examine Jews for Tay-Sachs more than you would examine African Americans for Tay-Sachs.
It doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter. It's a disease. It's a disease.
I don't say that it's necessary, but I think that the category system that is established within modern science has also to be we have to check for racist and anti-Semitic elements there that gets established within there that might be under the evidence-based science, and it might not be that evidence-based, that rather
I agree.
A continuation of the...
But I don't think, I was only saying, I don't think that genetic work itself, by saying that certain diseases are more likely in certain populations, that part of it isn't necessarily racist. There might be others that are racist. I mean, you know, we know that from the first half of the 20th century.
Yes, This question is rather historical and perhaps really only of scholarly interest, but anyway, you mentioned that the, let's say, Soviet anti-Semitism and its proliferation then to the Arab countries can be traced down to the conflicts within Russian socialist circles, right, and the socialist parties.
No, these are two dimensions that aren't identical, but keep on going.
Well, what I was wondering, just at the point where you said that, was whether one should not really trace this position, which was taken by the Soviet Union and its European allies, including Eastern Germany, to the fact that at no point really did they succeed to turn that Zionist colonial project, which in fact was part of a larger British colonial project, into their own, to somehow make use of it, and certainly not after the Second World War, when it came from British protection, it came under American protection, so that this kind of failure of the Soviet Union to somehow get a hold of this rather leftist project, as a matter of fact, and then to turn over the order in the region to its own advantage, would be the actual reason for their then digging this up and really making it into an instrument of their own policy over there, as you pointed out.
Well, I would have to distinguish about a few things in what you said, okay? The coming into being of Israel was fought against the British. It wasn't a British project.
Well, after World War II, yes.
After World War II, they were fighting the British. And as a matter of fact, in 1949, after Israel already is independent, and the Royal Air Force is stationed in Suez, and there is a dogfight over Sinai between Israeli planes and the RAF, and the Israelis shoot down a couple British planes. Headlines in Britain are Jewish Reds shoot down RAF planes. You're right that I think the Soviet Union hoped, because it was directed against the British, the Soviet Union hoped that they could gain influence. They're the first country to recognize Israel. The first was the Soviet Union. In the fight of 47-48, the Israelis got their arms from Czechoslovakia. What many people think was a turning point for Stalin was the first ambassador to the Soviet Union was Golda Meir, and when she came, tens of thousands of Jews went on the streets in Moscow to greet her. And it's at that point that Stalin seems to have turned very strongly. Whether the trials in 1952 were because of this, I'm not sure. For those of you who don't know, in Czechoslovakia in 1952, the entire Central Committee of the Czechoslovak Communist Party is put on trial. Of the Central Committee, there are 14 of them, 11 are Jews. Now, these were old communist Jews. Many had fought in the Spanish Civil War. However, during the trial, they're characterized in really classical anti-Semitic terms. Ruthless, cosmopolitan, they work with shadowy global powers, but now, because it's only 7 years after the war, they can't say the shadowy powers our international Jewry, they say Zionism. And that's a different form of Soviet anti-Zionism than the more kind of traditional leftist hostility towards any kind of national self-identification on the part of Jews. It's a very different order. And it was that kind of anti-Zionism that returned in 1967. And you begin to have these unbelievable posters coming from the Soviet Union.
Like what? Sorry.
That the Jews are the Nazis. And they're the enemy of humanity.
Well, I was just to explain why I put the British in, because obviously after the First World War, when the whole region, the former Ottoman Empire, was divided up, it was, after all, under
British mandate.
Under British mandate,
yes.
This project of Zionism could start. So this is why I brought
yes, no, it's true. It's just a complicated story.
Yes, of course.
You know, because when there's an Arab uprising in 1936 to 1939 in Palestine, the British, you know, they're caught between two forces. The British decide no more Jewish immigration into Palestine, just as the war begins. For which a lot of people, Jews in Europe and in Palestine, never forgave them. So it's a complicated story. And the Jewish terrorists, people like Shamir, who blew up the King David Hotel and killed many people, they were anti-British. And they were terrorists.
Can I ask a question related to that? There's an article by Anne. It's called, I think, Civil Alliance for the 7th.
It's called?
I think it's called Civil Alliance for the 7th Week or something like that. And it's talking about Arab and Jewish collaboration against the Brits and collaboration in the bigger picture before the proclamation of before the building of the state of Israel. Because this
I don't know it.
But actually, this is like relating to what you said before. It's much more complicated. There are also anti-colonial dimensions of this nation building process, and this is like a text which works on Jewish and Arab collaboration being anti-colonial.
Yes, there was that moment, but it was, to be very honest, it was a minority movement on both sides. One wishes that it weren't, but it was. Alice? Yeah. I can't hear you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. My question is not necessarily connected to antisemitism. It's about another item. Some 20 years ago, you wrote about Hitler, of the Hitler controversy.
Yeah, that was a while ago, yeah?
Yeah, it's a while ago.
I hate to
remember the exact words, but you wrote about the regression of the second generation of Germans. So now, let's say third generation. So, what would you say now about this, let's call it situation? Maybe. So 30 years later,
there's a problem that I have in answering that, not because of the question. When I wrote the piece on Bitburg, I had just returned to the States from Germany after having lived for 10 years in Frankfurt, and I had a pretty good feel for the way things were in Germany. I don't think I have that feel now. And I certainly don't have it for Austria, which has not exactly a glorious past. But I don't have that feel for then what it means now. So I'm afraid that I couldn't really, I'd have to, spend a few more years in Central Europe, and then I could write an update. Either people are shy or there's nothing more left to say.
There's a lot to say.
Welche Rolle spielt eigentlich der Staat bei Ihren Überlegungen zum Antisemitismus?
It's a very general question. So,
in Ihrem klassischen Aufsatz spielt der Staat ja eigentlich keine Rolle. Und das ist ja schon die Frage, wie sich diese allgemeine Gedankenform dann tatsächlich auch im Bewusstsein der Subjekte durchsetzt. Und historisch ist es ja schon so, dass der Staat da eine Rolle gespielt hat. Und es wäre eben die Frage, ob man eben nicht den Staat auch mit einbeziehen müsste in diese Überlegung.
If I were writing about a historical treatment of the Shoah, starting with Germany, I would. But I was trying to explain, I was trying to clarify what anti-Semitism is and why it swept through Europe beginning in the late 19th century. The pogroms, which begin in the 1870s, were part of this. They weren't some sort of medieval reste. So this was an international movement that didn't conquer state power until the Nazis. Then, of course, you have an interaction, but the state doesn't create the consciousness. The state undertakes certain actions. You pass laws, etc., so things aren't just mob action. But the state is not the origin. But as I said, if I were writing about the Nazis in power, of course I would try to deal with the state as well. But I thought when I wrote this that there was a great deal of misconception about anti-Semitism and also about what the Shoah, about what the Holocaust was. And I think people just put it in the same bag as other forms of mass murder. I'm not saying one is worse or better than the other, but it's different. And I was trying to clarify that difference. I don't think that the spread, like a wildfire, of anti-Semitism in Europe from the English Channel to the Ural can be explained simply in terms of states. Was my hypothesis.
Yeah, just a question of terms. You use the term of modern anti-Semitism for what is the topic here today, and another old anti-Semitism before that. Now, other authors, as I understand, use the word anti-Judaism for that, at least in German. Could you just shortly explain why you choose that term, anti-Semitism, for the older phenomenon instead of anti-Judaism, which, after all, describes it?
I'm not wed to the notion of referring to earlier forms as anti-Judaism. I'm not wed to that notion. If people like David Nirenberg want to talk about it as anti-Judaism, that's fine with me. But they should see that there's a break in the modern period. And I use anti-Semitism because that was the name the anti-Semites gave themselves. That's not a name that I or anybody else has invented and slapped onto this movement. That was the self-naming of that movement itself.
Well, yes, but it wasn't for the Christian anti-Semites, as you would call them, a few decades earlier, or for anti-Semitism in the European history.
Yeah, that's, if you want to call it anti-Judaism, that's fine with me.
Okay.
But anti-Judaism sounds as if it's only a religious dispute. And it never was.
You have spent quite some time around the Institute for Sozialforschung. How do you explain that in bookshops in the US, when you go to the critical theory part bookshelves, all you get is Judith Butler and Edward Said? What happened? Why is that critical theory in the US?
I can't answer that.
Try.
No, I can't. Because they think critical theory means any kind of criticism. I can't be responsible for American academia. Yeah, lie down.
Question actually following up on that. I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask that, but like, what would you say are the reasons why antisemitism is still conceptualized mostly equivalent to racism? Like, what is the reason? Like, why this misconception persists so consistently? I'm not talking about the society, but here about the academic research sort of sphere of antisemitism. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but like I had the impression the mainstream teaching of antisemitism is still keeping it as an equivalent, or taking it as an equivalent basically to other forms of discrimination, racism, and not grasping the character. Why is that sort of so widespread? Why is it so hard to convince, for instance, the Berlin Center for research? Like, why is it so hard to make the point in the academia?
I don't know. I mean, I wrote about anti-Semitism the way I did quite a while ago. There have been very, well-researched books by people like Shaul Friedlander that talk about anti-Semitism in, important ways. Or even earlier, the American academic German emigre, George Mosse, wrote about it. But for many academics, it's just another form of racism. There also is a tendency, unfortunately, for many, also Jewish academics, to want not to have the Jews stand out. I'll give you an example. When they were building the Holocaust Museum in Washington, one of their advisors was Simon Wiesenthal. And Wiesenthal said it shouldn't be a memorial or a museum only about the Shoah, because it should also commemorate the other 5 million victims. He made up that number. He admitted that later. There were no other 5 million victims in the camps. There weren't. He made it up because he didn't want to draw attention. He thought it's maybe not so good that what happened to the Jews should be portrayed as this is what happened to the Jews. So, well, it also happened to a lot of other people. And the Nazis would have exterminated everybody else to the east if they only had had a chance. That's wrong. But there's a kind of a social psychology involved. And I think exemplified by somebody like Wiesenthal. Is that? Yeah, so I don't agree with it. But there are a lot of people, well, we're just an institution and we're going to fight against any kind of prejudice. Different prejudices are different. They shouldn't be put together in one pot. That's my position.
Es gibt so eine letzte Möglichkeit.
Politically, sorry.
Nein.
I see the importance of insisting on the difference between anti-Semitism and many other forms of racism. But it's of course also important to remember that all other forms of racism have their own differences. So looking at the English debate, for example, the British debate, I can see how the Wiesenthal thinking to say, well, one thing we have to politically counter is precisely this idea that, on the one hand there is the oppressors of the world, and these are all victims of racism, and then there's anti-Semitism, which isn't really, these are people who are powerful anyway, and therefore we don't have to take the animus against them really seriously. That people would want to counter that by saying, yes, but there are, despite all differences, we have to insist on the fact that these are projections of groups that are kind of naturalized in one way or the other. For example, if we talk about anti-Muslim racism, of course, we're also not talking about genetically arguing defined racism in the sort of really narrow sense, but these are all cultural racisms. To say, well, in order to counter the fact that the struggle against these different forms of hatred now happen in different camps that are mutually hostile to each other. So if you're on the left, you're not interested, most people on the British left are not very interested in anti-Semitism, but they're very interested in postmodernism and racism. And if you're interested in anti-Semitism, you're automatically perceived to be on the right somehow, to be with the powerful, to be with the colonizers, and so on. And one can say it's so wrong, but I do understand the political impulse to say it's really important to see these as connected struggles somehow, and to get them together. And one way might be to say, well, we're just using this sort of more generalized notion of racism that includes cultural forms of racism, and then you can say, okay, within that, we have to distinguish anti-Semitism works differently from anti-black racism, works differently from anti-Muslim racism, and so on. So I don't know what to say to that whole political conundrum, because I find it really difficult where to stand on these things.
Well, I can't say where you should stand on it. I disagree with it.
Yeah.
Because what it does is it blurs what anti-Semitism is. So if you just say, I'm against anti-Semitism, I certainly am against anti-Muslim racism, I'm against racism against Africans, etc., etc., etc. Then somebody else says, but Jews aren't so badly off. Why are you putting them in the pot? And they would be right. They're different, and that difference has to be emphasized, I think. Not being in England, I can say it. I know it would be very difficult in the UK. I think so. Okay.